All righty. All righty. We're live. Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Weathers. I'm here on a Wednesday night with your Vitality Project and with my dear friend Michael Marar.
Hey Bob, how's it going? I think we said
Doing it?
more words today before we got on than we ever have. It's still only about a minute, but usually
Yeah.
we jump
Yeah.
straight in
We
just to
usually
make sure we
dive.
don't miss something.
Yeah. Well, we did say just a few words, but we didn't talk much about the topic for tonight is how to apply spiritual resources in times of difficulty. I think maybe this time qualifies. I read something in the New York Times this morning, Michael, that said that this year, 2020, will be remembered as very few other years in U.S. history. And it was striking to me. They compared it with just 3 other years. They talked about 1968. I remember 1968. That was a time of such foment politically, civil rights, the Democratic Convention. Both my brothers were at UC Berkeley right then. I was in 8th grade, and I remember that year quite well. That was the year of the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. So anyway, 1968 was a really pivotal year. 1945, the end of World War II, and 1865, the end of the Civil War, and they compared it with just those years, and so it was kind of trippy for me to think of. I mean, we're living it, and we're not nearly out of it, but 2020 it'll be interesting in hindsight. God willing, you'll outlive me by a significant number of years as you get further down the road, especially as you get more perspective on it. I'll be very curious to see how 2020 measures down, in terms of people's view. I'm very curious. History has a curious way of changing our perspective. It'll be very interesting to see. So in that context, this time of 2020, possibly a pivotal year in world history, how we apply spiritual resources. And Michael, the one thing that we talked about before we started is that I'm quite sure that wherever we go will not be what either one of us expected, and even less so those that are listening tonight. So let's just see where this dialogue takes us for a few minutes. How does that sound to you?
Sounds great, Bob.
All right. Thank you, Michael.
And yeah, I'm looking forward to having some retrospect on COVID.
Yeah, it'd be nice to have it in the rearview mirror, right?
Yeah. I've been thinking about this somewhat, Bob, because I think that spirituality, and I don't know, one of the first things that comes to mind this sounds like an academic way to think about it. I don't know, or I think you and I might both have a very secular way of thinking about spirituality and religion, but also still giving a lot of value to whatever one's choices or whatever one's beliefs. I know you do, and it's important to I'm not so hung up on what that is. It's more about the value of that and the meaning that it helps people to make. So I think a lot, because I think especially when people are struggling with anything, certainly if it's drugs and alcohol, and at some point I think it has the ability to bring a lot of comfort and help kind of make sense of some seemingly meaningless events.
Yeah, I like how you've laid that out, Michael. I tend to define spirituality in what feels like as broad, kind of generic a perspective as possible. I don't mean to water it down by calling it generic. I mean that it can be applied hopefully universally. And I tend to think of spirituality as whatever it is that supplies meaning, a sense of value and purpose. And I think that can be not only radically individual, but it's also radically contextual. And so I was thinking about it this morning, Michael. I was actually in the shower. I was thinking about it in the shower this morning. I don't know how it goes for you, but that ends up being a time for me that's kind of time out of time. And so I've been struck by between that and my early morning swimming, which I didn't get to this morning because I had that live event on Facebook this morning. Maybe it's a combination of time out of time and the watery context of it. I don't know, but
if I had everything in the bottle that I thought of in the shower, I would just love it. Like all the ideas.
Yeah.
And I've written them down, and I've kind of gotten out of that practice, but you reminded me to get back into it.
Yeah. It's a good idea. I'll tell you exactly what I was thinking this morning. I was thinking about, it gets to this definition of spirituality. Is I was thinking, and you'll relate to this because some of it applies directly to you, maybe a lot of it applies directly to you, is that I was in dialogue earlier today. This is after the shower experience. I was in dialogue with my alma mater. The college I went to was Fresno Pacific College, and I was in dialogue with their alumni director for various reasons. They're not really pertinent right now, but I started at Fresno Pacific in the fall of 1977. As a psychology major and as a religion major, so religious studies. And so I had a double major. And then I graduated from there 2 years later, and then went into a 6-year program of study. As you know, that I got my doctorate in clinical psychology, but I got it at a seminary. And part of my training at the seminary was to also get a master's degree in religious studies. And so what I was reflecting on in the shower, this all happens, you know how it happens, it's in a nanosecond. It takes forever to freaking, Jesus, Paul, cut to the flipping chase already. It comes as a tick like that. So anyway, and then I taught at a university for 15 years, and I taught in the psychology department. I taught psychology. But I also taught courses there on religious issues in psychotherapy, for example. It was an elective that students from the master's and doctoral programs took. I never stopped being keenly interested. And then on top of it, I went into that 6-year postdoctoral training program at the Jung Institute, where we studied psychology and religion. And then some years later, I got into recovery. All of this came to me this morning as I was thinking, well, I would be very, very willing to acknowledge the severe outlier nature of my background. It is my background. And so when I got into recovery 10 years ago, and I was given prescriptions for how one should apply spiritual resources in recovery, it drove me flipping crazy. Flipping crazy. And how do I possibly integrate at that point 3 or 4 decades of immersion in 2 disciplines? What I was thinking about, later this afternoon, is that there are people that know more about psychology than me. If they took the time I took studying religion and focused all of that time on psychology, plus the time I took, that would mean they have nearly twice as much time, and it stands to reason they would have learned more. And the same about religion. There are people that know about more about religious studies than I do. Same thing. But there'd be very few people that know about as much about both of those as I do, because I flip and studied both for 40 years. Does that make sense? It's like, And so none of this is meant to be self-congratulatory. It's more meant to be consoling. Is that for me to come into a program, any kind of spiritually related program in recovery, and have somebody prescribe something without any appreciation for how complex an issue that is for me around integration of so-called spiritual resources with psychological issues in and around recovery. It's been a hard thing to translate. For the last 10 years. And I think what was in it, under the root of it, was less about, there was a little bit of being pissed off about that. There's a little bit of that, like F you. But I think more of it was grace towards myself, disgrace towards myself. It's like, I just happen to have come with this background, and if you add the fact that I got severely addicted, that makes me a very kind of small subset of people that got severely addicted and then show up at the doors of recovery. and are looking for applying spiritual resources in times of difficulty.
Yeah.
All of that, Michael. So it's just to say, it's made me want to be much more capacious or embracing when we talk about spirituality and recovery, because I care a lot about it, and you do, and a lot of people do. But I want to make sure that there's as broad an embrace as possible, because I certainly have felt what it feels like to be marginalized because my access to spirituality, etc., doesn't fit somebody's template. That's been extremely painful to me. It's been right at the heart of what I've struggled with in 10 years of recovery, is trying to find some respect. There's a lot of respect given to this idea of higher power. Well, just whatever is your higher power, Bob, is fine. But when I start talking about that, people start backing off from that statement. It's like, oh, I don't know about that. So,
yeah,
anyway.
Anything but that, Bob, please.
Yeah,
right?
So, yeah.
Well, I'm just curious, Bob, when you said marginalized, do you mean from, I don't know, when you said marginalized, I'm curious what, I could guess a couple of different things. So like,
yeah. I was thinking about you, Michael, just a little while ago. I took my trash bins outside, and I was thinking about you and how grateful I am to have met you.
Thank you, Bob. Yeah, me too.
Yeah. And I was thinking how we met, and then how we continued to have different shared experiences, including in particularly one kind of self-help support group within the recovery world. And I was just appreciating not being marginalized. And so when I talk about being marginalized, to answer you, there's a sense that as soon as I open my mouth, I can't say anything that doesn't kind of express who I am and even my history of how I've gotten to be here, any more than anybody else can be. But I think there's a risk in any disenfranchised population, and I think individuals who've been addicted, who are in early recovery or even deep recovery, I think that it's understandable that you get this kind of us against them thing gets going, If I look at it sociologically, I read a really interesting long article today about the sociology of the marginalized. And so certainly those in addiction know about being marginalized, and many people would say, well, they deserve it, and okay, let's just set that one aside. And so you get this kind of us against them thing going on. And one of the risks of that is that it can turn into kind of a totalitarian uniformity edict. Okay, we all think the same way, we dress the same way, we believe the same shit, all of that stuff. And then it becomes a fundamentalism of a different stripe than maybe other fundamentalisms, but it's no less a fundamentalism in terms of its dynamic. And I think that I'm going to go back to what you started with, Michael. I think that fundamentalism saves people's lives. I think it can, but I don't think it saves everybody's life. I think it saved my life when I was in my late teens, early 20s, from a very, very challenging childhood. I think it provided structure for me. I'm very grateful for it. And I didn't sign up to outgrow it, but I think that I did for whatever reasons. And I don't stop appreciating it, but it no longer contains me. And so to have somebody within a regime say, you've got to believe this way, dress this way, think this way, or you're lost forever. It can be in a religious context, you're not going to go to nirvana or heaven. And in a recovery context, it can be you're going to relapse. You're just that's stinking thinking, and it's going to get you in trouble. And that's not really helpful to be talked to that way. Right. And so I found a lot of that, and I don't want to whine about it. But I do tell you that I take it on as a mission, because it nearly took me out. It didn't. I believe it does take out people, and then that becomes an ethical issue for me. Is that then them is fighting words? That's not okay. That's not okay. If fundamentalism and exclusivism, if that works for somebody, that's fine. But if that's imposed on somebody who dies of addiction, because they couldn't find their way in or sustain a seat in the room. That's really a problem for me. And then I it's obviously overdetermined by my own experience, but I care a lot. I tend to care a lot about the so-called underdog or the marginalized, and you and I have been, and many people have been, that particular subset of a marginalized. It's like, it's not bad enough that you're considered an addict with a big fat A on your forehead. Now you're an addict that doesn't subscribe to my belief system. So you're like marginalized within the marginalized, and that's just severely fucked up to me. That's not okay with me.
Yeah, you said so many things there that I'm trying to decide which one to speak to, and I appreciate all of it, really. I saw something today so I'll start with this, and I think it'll cover a couple of them, but I saw something on Facebook today, and I saw it, and then it was, I guess it was removed or something, because what I did read of it, it said, we're not removing this, but we are not allowing any more posts on it because whatever, it upset enough people. And so what the post was something like, were you pro MAT, which was like medication assisted treatment, right? And so are you pro MAT or something about that, or a complete abstinence or something?
Yeah.
And it had like 300 some odd posts, and I was actually trying to get a screenshot and I kind of forgot about it until you just brought it up again, but I was gonna, I thought it might come up tonight, and now that I think about it, I wasn't then I think I thought of the topic and I didn't think I was going to bring it up. Anyway, somehow it said something about it may be removed, and then it was removed, okay, within seconds, because all of a sudden I'm like, where did this damn thing go? Because I was trying to read some of it, but I read enough to see, and you can just imagine what some of the posts were. Yeah. But in the same way, I'm thinking like around religion too, which is like, we're talking about in a really broad way, which could be very upsetting to some people, and to some people. And I'm also thinking about what you said about fundamentalism and I think you and I have talked about 12 steps in AA and how it can be really useful, but it also, in my opinion, if it does what it's supposed to do, and fundamentalism, maybe because it worked, you outgrew it, maybe something like that.
That's
and I'm thinking the same, and I'm thinking the same thing about sometimes it doesn't mean necessarily that it, and I don't mean to say outgrew it by then that is less than. It's just that it may not fit anymore because it worked and you're seeking more. It could have worked and you want to stay there. And so I'm not really saying one over the other. It's just that that's what does fit for some people. Yeah. And the mere fact that some people get really upset by the idea that you were wondering about, using medication versus abstinence. Yeah. Tells me, I don't know, that seems to be, then we're so locked in on the particularities of it than we are on outcomes. And unfortunately, that's what happens sometimes when things like AA work really well, is that then that becomes its own thing of itself, in which people are switching out their shadow from one thing to the other.
Yeah, that's well said. That's well said. My friend and maybe your acquaintance, I can't remember, 𝗥𝗜𝗦𝗄𝗏, who's been so instrumental in the kind of the foundations of integral recovery with John Dupuy. Both of them have published a number of books, which is really kind of a critical perspective on recovery, looking at it from multiple, it's really a postmodernist approach to recovery, which is why it's so appealing to me. 𝗥𝗜𝗦𝗄𝗏, who lives in Cape Town in South Africa, has written articles and may write another book on this topic. He refers to it as ideological addiction. And I think in it, back in the days of my studying religion more formally, I remember, I still remember this as an undergraduate. I was taking a course and the professor had a textbook on fundamentalism. And I was already moving out of it by the end of my undergraduate. And I thought, oh my God, they're teaching this shit and we're going to have to read this and believe this. I didn't realize till later. I actually did read the book, I think later in graduate school. I didn't take the course because of the book. And it was a very clear-eyed analysis of fundamentalism from somebody, in this case was Christian, but was not fundamentalist, and looked at the dynamics of it without being excoriating. He was just looking at it. He was analyzing, what is this phenomenon? And then I read a number of other books in that area. One of the best books on fundamentalism is not written from a religious perspective, and I like it because it's so short. Eric Hoffer's book, The True Believer, is just a wonderful analysis in a nutshell. He's sometimes called the longshoreman's philosopher. He just writes, I think he was a longshoreman who happened to be very bright. And he wrote this book, The True Believer, and it really is the psychology and the sociology of mass movements. But whether it's a technical textbook on fundamentalism like the one that was required, I don't remember the guy's first name. I think his last name might have been Barr, B-A-R-R. It's been 40 years since I read it. But, oh man, I lost my train of thought. This is Wednesday night. Dad nabbit.
This shit happens.
Yeah, it just happened right now. Let me spend a moment with that. I can't remember your last comment. I was responding to it, and I went too far afield for a tired brain. Sorry.
Yeah, but I don't know if this helps. And we're talking about fundamentalism, and I commented on how because it works so well, perhaps that's why you moved through it, and maybe just the rigidity.
Oh, I know. It was tied into Guy's book on Guy's material, 𝗥𝗲𝗀𝗃𝗃 on ideological addiction, is that what he's describing there is what those that are scholars in fundamentalism would talk about as fundamentalism. That's what characterizes it. It's where an ideology becomes more important than relationship, than the person. I have to tell you, and I have to whisper this because I don't want anybody to hear this. It's been one of my things that's rankled me when you read through the 12 traditions. They'll talk about principles over personalities. And I do know what they mean by that, and I support that. But the part of me that studied fundamentalism has a little bit of a quiver down my spine, because you got to be real careful about taking that too far, where abstract principles or ideologies end up mattering more than does compassion and humane ethics. Because I studied Christian religion most in depth, I think it's clear to me that that's what got Jesus in so much trouble. Whoever the mythical Jesus is and the historical Jesus, I'll leave that to scholars to discern. But that was kind of his point. It was like he was unrelenting in terms of busting people for missing the heart of spirituality for the sake of ideology. I mean, that's and within a generation or two, I had a course on the early Christian church. Within a generation or two, it all contracted back into ideology and got more extreme down through the centuries. It's what we humans do. It's really tricky, isn't it? The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao, but I want to tell you what the Tao is. I like how that in the Hebrew tradition, that when it's anglicized, they'll spell God with a G and an underline and a D. They won't spell it. That feels respectful to me.
Yeah.
Be careful about getting too familiar with your higher power.
Yeah.
Or maybe informal. I don't know.
Well, I think the tricky thing that you're speaking of is that I think it's hard for when we believe in something for it to then not take us away a bit. In some ways it's kind of got to be there. I don't know if it does, I think to get us to, I think we tend to get we believe something, and then it's hard for us to kind of hold that loosely and also then be up for considering maybe something. I think it was maybe talking about kind of contradictions and seemingly things that are opposing ideas and holding them in the same place. It's hard for us to do that, but I think it's so necessary to kind of remain fluid with ideas and willing to continue to learn and to not then take ideology to be something that marginalizes people. Because I guess the reason why I asked about the marginalization earlier is because to me, the hardest part was I was thinking the exact same thing that you said. Is it's not bad enough that you're kind of struggling with addiction, but then kind of marginalized within that, meaning if you're not down for 12 steps, then what's the matter? Then that, at least that's kind of what it was for me, which is, I think, what did I call that? I've called that like something square. I don't know if I called it marginalized squared or something kind of.
That's right. Yeah.
And then it ends up, it's to me, it's just not a great place to be in, especially when it's kind of coming from within, meaning people that you would like to be able to be in community with, and then kind of expected to kind of have a singular kind of way of thinking of it, and not much room for fluidity there, at least for me. And for some people, that's works for them. I just think that it's important for it to be on the menu and not to be the menu.
Yeah, well said. Well said. We're talking about spiritual resources. We're talking about other dimensions of both addiction and recovery from addiction, maybe it wouldn't matter so much. But spirituality, in terms of what we started with, which was looking at what provides meaning, is so radically subjective. And so as soon as we turn that into an objective law or rule or creed, we're at risk not only of squeezing the life out of the spirituality, but also people, and we're talking about people in recovery from addiction who need to be rehumanized. And so it seems it's really tragic to me. Ken Wilber calls it a performative contradiction. That would be the way I talk about spirituality despiritualizes things. I got to be really careful about doing that. I really want, I think it's why I care so much about this. Probably you too, Michael. I do believe the spirit. Let me just finish this. I do think the spiritual dimension of our lives is critical. In fact, I really do believe it's supreme. And so it must be handled with humility, it seems like to me. It's really the blessing of the 12-step program is the talk of surrender and of humility. I mean, it's wound throughout the entire program, letting go of ego and all of that. And even though we can critique it in very useful ways and so on, in this context, to talk about a humble approach to that which is greater than ourselves, I think that's critical. And then let's be careful about getting too facile with defining that which is greater than ourselves, because by definition, it's greater than our language, it's greater than our ideology. And so can we honor that dynamic without getting caught in literalisms? That seems really important to me. You were going to say something. In fact, why don't we finish with your final thoughts here, whatever they are. We've got time.
Yeah. First, if you could repeat, because I started thinking too much about what I wanted to say, but at the same time, I noticed something that you said that I think is really important, which was around the spiritual, like the way we're doing spirituality could become, what was that you said, like unspiritual or?
I said I talked about Ken Wilber, who's written so much about this in Integral Theory, is that we can engage in what he calls a performative contradiction. And it's simply as I talk about spirituality or host spirituality in terms of rituals and so on like that, is that they can become counter-spiritual. I said despiritualize them. So the irony is that there's a 13th century Roman Catholic theologian and minister, Meister Eckhart, who I've read a lot over the years, and I liked it. He talked about the God beyond God. He said there's the God that we talk about, and as long as we kind of wink an eye at each other, we can talk about that. But he says there's a God beyond God that's the reason for all the rest of it. And be real careful about getting too concrete about that. I said literal. Get too literal around that, because by doing that, you're actually contradicting yourself as you speak. And so as soon as we turn that God beyond God into an ideology, then you need a God beyond that. That's for damn sure.
Well, and probably what you're talking about might some people, which I think is around truth, right? Which is that that might not be as static as we'd like it to be. We can believe it is if you'd like it to be. And I'm not to argue with anyone on that, because that could also be a very anchoring kind of thing, and I wouldn't want to mess with that.
Yeah. When I took a philosophy class at the ripe age of 18, it was my first philosophy class in college, and I wrote my term paper for that class on Immanuel Kant. And thank you, Spencer. He's thumbs up. I still remember what I wrote my paper on. This is an 18-year-old. I didn't know which way it was up. In fact, I was engaged in fundamentalism at that point, and gratefully so, honestly. But I took Kant seriously, and he made a distinction between two ways of knowing. One is phenomenal knowing, which is ever changing. It's for simplicity's sake, sensory phenomena. And then he, like Plato, believed that there's something behind that. He called it the noumenal realm. And he says about that, we have very little that we can say. He says we're limited in our cognitions by our senses and by just, he didn't write about this because we didn't know about it, but by our neuronal pathways and biology and genetic proclivities, all of that. And he says, so don't for a second mistake that which you experience in the phenomenal realm is the way things really are. And so there is a really are, but we have very little access to it. So you might say that whatever really is, I'm not going to say static because that violates Heraclitus, but I'll just say we don't have much to say about that. So we have these intimations about the noumenal realm, to follow Kant, but just hold that shit lightly, please. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, and that'll bring me to what I was going to say too, which I think that it's with what you said, it ties into it. At least it does for me as I'm thinking about it.
Yeah.
Which is I've said to someone before around kind of the 12 steps and some of the ideas around things like the things that we're talking about around different ways of looking at recovery, and that there's kind of if it were one thing on the menu, and that maybe questioning the idea that that relapse was part of recovery, and someone said, and someone who thinks very similar to you and I said something like, yeah, but people's lives are at stake here, people are dying. And I said, exactly. That's why this is so important, to not then be marginalizing people who don't necessarily align with it, because you're pushing people away under the guise that that's the only way to pull them in. And that's a very dangerous idea, I believe.
Yeah. People wondered who Jesus hung out with. He hung out with the pariahs, is who he hung out with. He hung out with the marginalized. And I feel like that it's one of the ways I resonate with you, Michael, is I think that you have a real heart for context and seeing people that are on the margins of the dominant paradigm, the dominant context. And I feel similarly, for whatever reason, I feel called to that. And I'm right with you. There's way too many people that are dying as an artifact of what we're talking about here. Ideological exclusion, whether we're talking about political or psychological, and in this case tonight, talking about spiritual language and forms where they get reified, they get concretized, and people fall off the side of the cliff. And that's just so radically not okay. It's really, I love what the Jungian psychologist James Hillman said. The first time I heard him, I went to a conference of his on depression, and Hillman said, he says, we Americans mistake grief for depression. He cited the thing that many of us have heard, including in training in psychology, that depression is anger turned inwards. And I'll never forget what he said. He said, outrage deserves outrage. An outrageous situation deserves outrage. And the alternative is stifling and is depression. He says, why not convert grief, at least at times, whether it's into sorrow and lamentation on the one hand, on the other hand, why not convert it into activism, outrage? I'm pissed off about this, and I really am not okay with this. And I feel like it's an undergirding of what we're talking about tonight. Michael, we haven't talked about this so much, but I assume it. I think it's probably implicit in your going to the university program you're in right now. You're in a program that really attempts, at least, to radically critique the conventions of psychology, the conventions of societal norms and so on. My undergraduate program was that way. Fresno Pacific, where I went, came from the Mennonite tradition. They had this peculiar combination. I'm so grateful. They were conservative theologically, which worked for me at that time. We've already established that worked for me. They were radical politically. And people go, is that possible? Yes, it is possible. The whole kind of, they call it the radical Reformation, the Anabaptist tradition during the time of Martin Luther and John Calvin, they kicked ass. They kicked ass, and they still do. They still do. And so there's a way. I'm no longer conservative theologically, but in terms of overturning the tables in the temple like Jesus did, I think we're talking about one of them right now that's simply not okay. And I know this has the risk of offending some people, and I don't, because of my wiring, I don't like people not liking me. So I have to go against that instinct, because I think it's really important that people hear this. And if they don't like me, I have to suffer that. And I do suffer that, but I feel like it's really important that there be voices for multiplicity in addiction recovery. And I think there's a lot of room at the top for this kind of conversation. Yeah.
I do too, Bob. And I'll close up with saying this. I was thinking about that exact same idea earlier today around depression. Well, things get called depression a lot, and I do think that's we're people are grieving things, whether it be the loss of a relationship, the loss of hopes and dreams, or and because I was working with a client earlier today that made me think of this exact same thing, and the same client also had me thinking about the other thing that you're saying around sometimes people isn't protest, sometimes a very, instead of maybe pathologizing that it's a very reasonable response, and it's a very healthy response. Being mentally healthy is not a product of becoming so accustomed to injustice that we just say, that we're not protesting. That's what we should be doing. It's not a matter of getting accustomed to an unjust things going on. I mean, sometimes I think and so I think it's important to really acknowledge protest when I see it. And luckily I spotted some today, and it made a different kind of conversation.
Psychology and the world is better for you being in it with all that you've just said. I'm really grateful for that, Mike. I'm really grateful for you to be in my world. Thank you. And I in yours. Yeah, really grateful. Yeah. I want you to know that I've had people reach out to me separately from our program and speak specifically about how much they appreciate you, Michael. So your voice is getting out there through these every other week meetings. And I resonate anytime somebody says that. I go, no kidding.
Yeah, I appreciate the feedback. Yeah. Thanks for saying it. It means a lot. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's the truth. It's the truth. Absolutely. It's the truth squared. It's the truth for you.
No, right. That is the real truth. Now we can. Right.
It's the noumenal truth. Yeah. Michael, thank you for tonight. I wish you Godspeed this week. Stay safe, my friend. I'll see you in a couple of weeks right before Christmas, I think. I'll look forward to seeing you again. And I invite anybody to come back and join us. If anybody has comments from today, if you find this later, in fact, it looks like Spencer is watching us, and he says, you won't offend me. He says, both of you, thank you for your insights. Bless you, Spencer. Thank you. It only takes a little bit of support to flourish, and you're magnificent, Spencer. Thank you. So we'll be back in 2 weeks, and Michael and Bob and Spencer. Okay. I invite anybody that wants to interact with Michael can write me through Vitality Project. It's your Vitality Project. You can just look it up online, and I'll get that to Michael. Okay. All right, my friend. Blessings to you. Have a good evening. Okay.
You too, Bob.
Thanks for
Take
joining
care.
me, Michael. Okay.
You bet.
Right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.